Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. Wednesday, September 11th, is the 18th anniversary of the 2001 terror attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, commonly known as 9/11. The aftermath of 9/11 was profound for the United States and the rest of the world, when the U.S. began its so-called war on terror. Internationally, the U.S. launched at least two wars, first against Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban and to ostensibly capture Osama bin Laden, the alleged mastermind behind 9/11. This still continuing war is now the longest war in U.S. history. 1.5 years after 9/11, the U.S. also went to war against Iraq. Domestically, one of the most significant developments of 9/11 was the passage of the so-called USA Patriot Act. This law, which was passed a mere 6 weeks after 9/11, allowed the U.S. government to indefinitely detain non-citizens, to surveil telephone, email, and financial records without a court order, and to access business records, including library and financial records. When the Patriot Act expired in 2015, Obama signed a new version of the law called the Freedom Act, which is set to expire by the end of this year. Last month, the Trump administration urged Congress to extend the Freedom Act's provisions of mass telephone surveillance indefinitely. However, a coalition of 30 digital rights, social justice, and civil liberties groups urged House Democrats on Monday not to renew Section 215 of the law, which allows the government to collect phone metadata without court authorization. In a related development, a federal judge ruled last Wednesday that the U.S. government's terrorism watchlist, which contains the names of at least 1.2 million people, most of them non-U.S. citizens, is unconstitutional. According to the judge, quote, "The risk of erroneous deprivation of plaintiffs' travel-related and reputational liberty interests is high, and the currently existing procedural safeguards are not sufficient to address that risk," end quote. Joining me now to discuss the after-effects of 9/11 is Marjorie Cohn. She's Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law and a former president of the National Lawyers Guild. Thanks for joining us again, Marjorie.
My pleasure, Greg.
So let's start with the most recent development first, the ruling that the terrorism watch list is unconstitutional. The case was brought by the Council on American Islamic Relations, representing 19 U.S. citizens who are on the list. Just how significant is this ruling, and what does it mean in practice for those who are on the list?
It's quite significant because the Obama administration quietly approved a substantial increase in people on the terrorism watch list. On 9/11, there were 16 names on this list. Today, there are tens of thousands of names, as you said. And the plaintiffs in this lawsuit claimed that they had, this is not a no-fly list, which is more severe than the terrorism watch list, but it's similar. And the judge in this case that you talked about actually used principles from the no-fly list. But the terrorism watch list means that people can be stopped when they're traveling, when they're stopped by a police officer, pretty much any time, and harassed, indefinitely detained, their phones and laptops confiscated, interrogations. And these plaintiffs claimed that they had suffered pretty severe deprivations, injuries. One went to the hospital. He was on life support at one point, I believe. And so they were not sure that they were on this list because the government doesn't tell you you're on the list, nor were they told what evidence was used to put them on the list if they were on the list, nor were they told how they could refute the evidence, so-called evidence, and get off the list. And so that's mainly why this judge, U.S. District Court judge in the Eastern District of Virginia, decided that this was unconstitutional, it was too vague, and granted what is called summary judgment, which means that there are no material issues of fact that a jury could decide. And so the plaintiffs won at this point, but it's not a complete win because what the judge did was to send the case back and order that the parties file briefs about how this system could be made more fair, so it wouldn't violate due process. In other words, remedies that these plaintiffs could get. So this was a very significant ruling, but again, a partial ruling.
Now, As you mentioned, it's not generally known how many people are on this list or how they get placed on the list. And it became quite notorious after 9/11 when thousands of people, as you mentioned, were denied permission to board airplanes because they were on a subset of that list, that is the no-fly list. Now, how do these lists exactly impact civil liberties? I mean, and if once they're on it, is there any recourse to actually get off of it, especially now after this ruling?
Well, at this point, there isn't a recourse to get off of it. And that's why the judge sent the case back, basically told the parties to file briefs to talk about making these procedures comply with due process. But people are not told they're on these lists. Secret evidence is used to put them on the lists. Even uncorroborated Facebook posts can be used. There is a standard of reasonable suspicion, which is a pretty low standard, lower than probable cause, that the government supposedly uses to put people on this list. And the standard is based on the totality of the circumstances. That means all of the factors. And they use the words articulable intelligence or information, although that's not defined, taken together with rational inferences from those facts, lead one to believe that someone is a known or suspected terrorist. And it is very, very vague, which is one of the problems that the judge found with it. Another problem is that the government, in putting people on these lists, can consider race, ethnicity, religious affiliation, beliefs, protected by the First Amendment, including freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and redress of grievances. They can look at people's history, associates, business associations, international associations, a study of Arabic, for example, just about anything to put people on these lists. And really, it only takes one single person in the White House who has unilateral authority to put people on these lists. So the judge was, I think, justifiably concerned about this and the constitutional ramifications, which is why the ruling came out the way it did.
Now, I want to turn to some of the other domestic consequences of 9/11. That is the collection of phone records known as metadata of practically all U.S. citizens. Since June 2013, we know, thanks to Edward Snowden's leaks, that this has been going on for a long time. Last October, though, a declassified Inspector General's report revealed that most of the data that was being collected was useless, and that the National Security Agency apparently ended the program shortly after this report came out. However, the Trump administration apparently would like to see it revived. What would you say now remains of the Patriot Act and the consequences that 9/11 had on civil liberties?
Well, metadata is basically websites people visit, numbers they call, and the government, this is what Edward Snowden revealed, that the NSA, National Security Agency, was looking for patterns so that they could use this to target people and basically spy on them without complying with the Fourth Amendment warrant, et cetera. And you cited that study that showed that this metadata is practically useless. And metadata, interestingly, is also used in deciding who to target with drones, which is another result of the post-9/11 era. Bush started droning people. I think his first drone attack was in Yemen, and Obama took this to an even higher level. I think he was using drones to attack people in 7 different countries. And Ars Technica did a study and found that the metadata that's used to decide what people a drone will target resulted in 99% false positives. So virtually useless, and yet they're still using it. And as you say, the Trump administration, even though the evidence shows that it's not reliable, want to continue to use it. This is not surprising given Trump's allergy to evidence-based and scientific evidence and data. And the problem is that for political reasons, most people in Congress don't have the backbone to stand up to the government when the government says, oh, we have to fight terrorism. And they don't want these people who are standing for re-election in the Congress don't want to be accused of being soft on terror. And so they roll over. After 9/11, it took about 3 weeks, as you said, for the Congress to pass the USA Patriot Act. And many of the provisions in the Patriot Act had been, they had tried to get them through, the government had tried to get them through before 9/11, and Congress said no. But after 9/11, I think it was a 582-page bill. Most people in Congress didn't even read it. ACLU staffers reported that congressional aides had called them the day after the vote on the Patriot Act to find out what their congressional members, had voted on. And so they're kind of flying blind, knee-jerk response to terrorism. And of course, that's not all. We had surveillance, increased surveillance, and the drones. We have the torture program, and 2 major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, illegal wars, never should have happened as a result of 9/11 or in the wake of 9/11. And now we're celebrating the 18th anniversary of the longest war in U.S. history, the war in Afghanistan. In addition to drone attacks, regime changes, and other kinds of interferences and interventions in many, many different countries, particularly in the Middle East. So 9/11 had a profound effect on our liberties, but also the lives of people around the world. Untold numbers of people have died in these wars, in these drone attacks. Thousands of people have been tortured with so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. The Senate did an extensive study documenting the torture that had taken place, and yet no one at any level of authority has been held accountable. And that really, it was the responsibility of people in the Obama administration, because under the Take Care Clause of the Constitution, the president has the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And yet Obama said, yes, well, we tortured some folks, but we'd rather look forward, not backward. And I think he was thinking about himself, not wanting to become a defendant in a war crimes prosecution in the future. And they also protect each other. And so there's been tremendous fallout since 9/11.
Well, I think that's very important to keep this in mind, this history, but also looking forward, if this the Freedom Act gets basically extended, and as the Trump administration wants to do. But we're going to have to leave it there for now. I'm speaking to Marjorie Cohn, Professor Emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law. Thanks again, Marjorie, for having joined us today.
Thank you, Greg.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.